For 3.5 centuries, Kale Vtoran had worn the crown as if it were a second skin, worn smooth at the chin, heavy along the temples, stamped with the same slow certainty as the rings upon his hands. The metal did not lie. It kept its shape while he changed. He had become an ancient thing in a young world, a king whose laugh had thinned into a rare sound, and whose steps measured the pace of seasons rather than of people. Moonlight pooled in the courtyards of Valoran, as it had when he first learned to shift. The wolves came and went. The tides of trade altered the banners. Houses rose and fell like harvested grain. Yet the center of the court held. From it, Kale watched centuries gather like dust on the throne. His mate had been gone 200 years. The memory of her presence did not fade so much as it altered its gravity. Once a star that wheeled around him, now a distant, luminous body that tugged at him with steady, inexplicable force. The kingdom knew the shape of his loss, in the same way they knew the hour the moon would be full. A fact of life in Valoran. They called it the long mourning. They embroidered it on cushions, wrote it into the arc of official speeches, and built an entire etiquette around approaching a ruler who carried sorrow like armor. For Kale, the sorrow had become the map of the world, the roots of policy, affection, curiosity, all threaded through it. He had ruled well by many measures. Rivers were policed, borders steadied, wolves fed by decree and not only by favor. But governance had never quite stitched the private hole inside him. That hollow lived deeper than policy briefings and tax ledgers. It lived in the way the moonlight fell on the combs in his private room, falling across a vanity where some combs were kept for a pair and others only for a solitary hand. It was Grior who argued the necessity of the choosing. Head of council, wearier perhaps than any man present for the weight of small betrayals and delayed grain shipments, Grior used a voice made of ledger and precedent. "The realm needs certainty," he said in the morning chamber, "and you owe the houses an heir, Majesty. There are customs. House alliances sour if the succession wavers." Around him the other counselors murmured, as if reciting a litany they had practiced through generations. Elena Blackthorn presented petitions in a voice like clipped silk. Lady Isolde of Morwen arranged her arguments with precise courtesy. Marcus, head of the guard, and Kale's most faithful friend, did not have to speak to be heard. He simply stood near the door, a silhouette of steady muscle and history, eyes always watching. Yet more pressing than the council's arguments were the houses themselves. 1,000 invitations had been dispatched, folded in wax and promise, carried by riders over moonlit roads and through winter-bent pines. The number carried a weight. 1,000 families, 1,000 petitions, 1,000 ambitions prepared to be offered at a single table. To most observers it was a spectacle of politics dressed as romance, daughters paraded like banners, alliances wagered for what a name could steady. To the people it would be talked of for years, the 1,000 women who vied for Valoran's crown, a phrase both literal and figurative, because among those who traveled there were not merely the daughters themselves, but attendants in carriages, mothers with old grievances, cousins with claims, and retinues for private audiences in the gardens and antechambers that lay beyond the hall's marbled sightlines. The number became an atmosphere. You could feel it in the corridors, heavy as perfume. It pressed on the walls. It insisted that something significant would happen. Kale had agreed to the ceremony, reluctantly. He had no intention of letting strangers dictate the rhythm of his private life. Yet he had tolerated the pageantry as a final concession to the old rules. "Let them perform their hearts," he had told Gregor once, "and when the last fan settles, let the matter end." He had tried to believe in his own detachment. For a long time he had been practiced at not being moved.
He had watched joys and sorrows pass like weather across the banners, and had learned, through bitter instruction, to keep his face steady. Sorrow had taught him economy with affection. He rationed his expressions as if they were precious fuel. On the morning of the choosing, the hall of silver was already a hush of satin and armor. Torches were banked in sconces carved like moons. Tapestries embroidered with the kingdom's wolf lore hung like remembered histories. The wolves, summoned by custom, padded into their place near the dais. Shadow, a dark shape with one scar through his lip. Storm, restless and watchful. Ash, whose fur caught light like a cloud over granite. Ember, younger and burnished. And Ghost, pale and dignified. They settled and unbreathed in keeping with the ritual, their ears catching the tremor of human emotion as if it were a sound. Wolves, the court often said, were a ruler's conscience made flesh. They reflected moods in a way appointments could not. The procession began with a cadence of soft footfalls and rustled fabric. The first prongs of light from the torches licked silver goblets held high by pages. Ladies of esteemed houses were arranged in graduated splendor, brocades, embroidered gloves, veils that hid small smiles and sharp calculations alike. House Morwen presented its daughter as a living cask of music and shifting grace. She folded into a display of lichen, shifting in a manner cultivated for generations. Her change a practiced, showy thing intended to display lineage and control over the animal self. The crowd applauded her skill and the pact it implied. A family comfortable with the beast within, a safe bet for heirs. The procession began with a cadence of soft footfalls and rustled fabric. The first prongs of light from the torches licked silver goblets held high by pages. Ladies of esteemed houses were arranged in graduated splendor, brocades, embroidered gloves, veils that hid small smiles and sharp calculations alike. House Morwen presented its daughter as a living cask of music and shifting grace. She folded into a display of lichen, shifting in a manner cultivated for generations. Her change a practiced, showy thing intended to display lineage and control over the animal self. The crowd applauded her skill and the pact it implied. A family comfortable with the beast within, a safe bet for heirs.
Another house sent a daughter who presented a blade rather than a song, parading a sword that had belonged to an ancestor who had once kept a border quiet for a decade. Her display was martial and proud. It drew murmurs of approval from the veteran commanders in attendance and a few sober nods from Gregor. A small noble from the southern marshes sent a poet instead of a display of shift or steel. The verses were of moon and fen and absence. They took the breath from the hall and held it, for a minute, as if the hunger inside Kale might be answered by the right cadence. No one in this room could not recite the prices of politeness. The performances were currency as much as coin. Each gift, each bow, each embroidered handkerchief was an exchange in the invisible markets of marriage and favor. Outside in the antechambers the numbers thinned. Not every invitation had delivered a daughter to the dais. Some remained hidden among the tangles of attendants and dowries, unpresented but not unpressing. Women crowded into alcoves and gardens, waiting for private audiences or for the chance to lay petitions in passing. Houses deployed their retinues like small armies of attention. The 1,000 was present as potential, an electricity in the air, more chorus than a literal convergence. In this way, the title, 1,000 Women Battled, found its truth, not in a brawl of limbs and blood, but in 1,000 hopes that collided beneath the same vaulted roof. The servants moved like an invisible undertow beneath the pageantry. They were taught to be unnoticed. Their worth was measured by the absence of their footprints in the tapestry of power. Arya had been trained so thoroughly in this art that her small feet could cross a marble step without waking the echo. She kept her head low more as habit than as timidity. Her blue eyes habitually catalogued instead of lingering.
Grandmother Tess had taught her to sew velvet and to fold cloth with the patience of someone who stitched a life together with careful hand. Bess, head cook, had taught her how to balance flavors to make men softer at table. Lessons that, in a court of steel and ceremony, were no small skill. Arya was not intended for the dais. She was meant for behind-the-scenes work, where the court's illusion did not require the visible presence of bodies like hers. She carried trays and soot and small truths that go unnoticed until someone drops a cup. The accident was one small human thing, impossible to predict and impossible to rehearse. It occurred in the middle of a presentation by a house whose daughter recited a genealogy that mapped alliances across decades. The words were long and dulled Kale's attention. This ceremony had been designed to be soporific, and his mind wandered to old griefs and the feel of wolf fur between his hands. The room's light was a wash of torch fire and braid, as a tray, balanced on Arya's palms, caught on a corner of velvet too trickily folded. Her tray wobbled.
A golden cup, set aside for the king's private acceptance later, slid and met marbled stone. The sound was a brief metallic sing, then a harsher break, gold against stone, the note fracturing like a spine. Silence pressed into the hall like snow. People gestured, some startled, some pretending not to have seen. Servants gasped and reached for the shards, shame already flushing their faces. 100 little hearts sprinted in quickened rhythm among the retainers. The noblewoman speaking froze. The cadence of her speech snapped like a string. Grior's hand tightened on the edge of his seat. Elena Blackthorn's face set into an old anger. Affronts must be punished swiftly to keep social order. In the ritual language of Valoran, a dropped cup was a near crime if it fell in the ceremonial radius. It could be read as an insult to the king, an affront to the throne. For the servants, it was humiliation. For houses looking to curry favor, an opportunity to distance themselves. For the council, an occasion to instruct. Arya's hands moved toward the shards as if they were the most ordinary of things to touch. Her palms were steady only because she had practiced 1,000 tasks requiring steadiness. Steadiness was her survival. Yet blood came quickly. An errant splinter kissed a knuckle, and a small, bright bead of red gathered there. The sight of it performed an unpracticed thing. The crowd leaned in, as if the blood might tell them what the shard's fall could not. The servile architecture of the court, which depended on the invisibility of people like Arya, was calibrated to pin shame upon those who breached order. The usual script would require public scolding, a forfeiture of favor, an exemplary humiliation that reminded all onlookers of their place. Kale, when he turned, did not do so because ceremonial law required him. He did not turn because a counselor motioned. He turned because somewhere in the long, slow geography of his grief, something stirred that he had not believed could move again. The wolves had already noticed. Shadow lifted his head and focused on the small figure in the marble aisle. Storm rose with a rustle of fur. Ghost's pale muzzle turned toward the sound of the cups breaking. The court's attention followed the wolves' muscles as if they had been led by a tug on a leash the size of stars. Marcus's hand was at Kale's sleeve, a conditional question in the muscle. "Do you do this now?" Grior's eyes were ledger still. Elena's lips were a tightened line. As the king, Kale had learned to command and to catalog. In that moment, he discovered a simpler impulse: to protect. He stepped off the dais with a motion that snapped the ceremonial rhythm. It was small, almost casual, as if removing a cloak.
The room exhaled collectively, as though a spell had been disrupted. Walking down the hall, he bent and cupped Arya's hand with his own to lift the shards away.
The hands he used, hands that had gripped the hilts of treaties and the rope of banners, were careful. He cradled her injury as if he had cradled something fragile in another life. The crowd shifted like a tide confused by a new wind. "You will be tended," he said, not loudly, but set with a softness that startled the courtiers. His voice carried more weight than the sound of it. Where he placed a word, the room began to order itself. He did not pronounce judgment on the servant. He moved as if the simple act of touching an injured hand were less scandalous than the omission of it. It was not only the touch that unmade the ceremony. It was the way he looked at the girl, open, uncalculated, unafraid. For a man who had once measured his expressions to the smallest ration, the sight of such unadorned attention became a kind of theft. It was as if the moon itself had shifted and revealed, for a single heartbeat, a forgotten shore. Guests struggled to reconcile that the king would stoop so. Some were quick to scowl with propriety. Others were suddenly and guiltily human. The servile protocol, which often had the shape of ritualized cruelty, was disrupted by an act of simple kindness. That the act became a proclamation surprised no one more than Kale himself. Greshor recovered the measure of ceremonial necessity quicker than most. "Majesty," he began, but the word did not command the hall the way it once might have. There was now a new fact in the room, that the king had favored a hand he had not been made to favor. Kale drew a breath and said something unadorned, a decisive insistence. "She will be seen." He did not frame it in courtly terms. He did not couch it in the jargon of alliances. It landed in the hall like a peal of clear bell. The phrase carried 1,000 meanings: safety, status, defiance, against those whose politics rely on invisibility. For the servant classes, sight was a gift. For the nobility, it was a disruption. Whispers unfurled like a slow skirt around the room. Elena's posture hardened into the posture of an offended woman who would not let such an affront pass. "Majesty," she said, her voice a lowly blade, "this was an accident. The cups are reserved for the proper presentation." "And yet," Greshor interrupted, already shifting to repair the fissure, "protocol." Kale's hand found the banister as he moved back toward his seat. He did not need to be king to deliver a look, and it was that look that calmed the most procedural dissent. "End the ceremony," he said. The words were neither loud nor theatrical, merely final. They snapped the pageant like the blade of a well-honed shears. Pages stilled. Women adjusted gloved hands. Carriages in the antechamber hummed with distanced surprise. There are moments no law can bind. That was one. The ceremonial choreography collapsed, not into chaos, but into a reordered hush. The 1,000 invitations had promised something grand, an hour of spectacle, and in the span of a bowed head and a gathered shard, the hour remade itself. Marcus moved in a graceful arc toward the servants and offered a steadying hand to the small figure who would not be publicly humiliated. Bess, who ran the kitchens and had a mercy lined up for such injuries, pushed through the retinues with a jug and bandages. Grandmother Tess, who had managed the household for 3 generations and had the cartography of respect sewn into her bones, appeared with a cloth and a silent, fierce gratitude in her eyes that said more than any proclamation. Later, in the hush that followed, as pages collected the glint of broken gold and the hall rearranged itself, talk turned to what the act would mean. Some insisted the king had performed a private mercy, an anecdote to be told over cups of warm wine to soften cheeks in winter.
Others read power into the deed and were newly cautious, counting the cost of a monarch who could choose against expectation. Arya, for her part, felt very small and very present at once. She had been trained to be unseen and now had become unavoidable. There was a strange, vertiginous sensation to being looked at by a king who had rarely let his eyes speak. She felt the weight of his attention like a sudden sunlight on skin starved of it. A million imaginings flitted through the hall. She resisted each with the steadiness that came of being taught to manage small disasters. She accepted the bandage without ceremony. Grandmother Tess murmured a prayer under her breath and tied the cloth with hands that smelled of lavender and ink. If what moved Kale was grief, then perhaps what he had recognized in Arya was not simply an injured hand, but the posture of someone who had learned to survive by seeing what others did not. She had an eye for truth, a gift of perception sharpened by necessity. The gift was not miracle, it was attention given depth. She knew how to read a face, how to find the lie that feathered a noble's praises. She had kept secrets and discovered small betrayals that mattered more in kitchens than in council rooms. For years she had observed the court like a map-maker, sketching the edges of people's intentions without calling attention to herself. When Kale guided her from the aisle, the wolves rose as if to follow him into a private world. Shadow moved ahead and sniffed the air around Arya's feet with the gentle inquisitiveness of a creature that recognizes the tone of sorrow in a human. Ember nudged her knee. The wolves' acceptance read like a stanchion of legitimacy that no courtly decree could match. News of the interruption spread before the last torch had burned its wick. Servants whispered through the kitchens. Pages ran like little flares with updated instructions. Messengers were dispatched with the soft urgency of gossip that knows policy will follow.
Grior convened his inner circle in a whispered conference near the dais. "We cannot allow precedent to be set," he said. His words were not entirely about law. They felt to his soul like salvage. Traditions must be kept or the social order frays. Elena saw in the king's action the loosening of cords she had spent decades carefully tying. "Do not be soft in this, Grior," she warned. "The houses will read this as favor to the lowborn. They will take liberties if we are not stern." But Grior was not deaf to the subtler music. He saw the way the wolves had shifted in the hall and the change in the courtiers' faces. He knew the ledger of public perception could not be repaired simply by sternness. A king's mercy had a peculiar kind of economy. Sometimes it returned more in loyalty than fear. He tapped his finger on the ledge of a table, thinking of bonds and the long arithmetic of the realm. "We will do what the realm requires," he said finally, and in so saying admitted the problem in a language that would not name the wound. Across the city, wagers were made in taverns and butcher shops about what the king's sudden attention meant. Poets began quietly composing new lines of court rumor to be traded later like currency. The 1,000 invitations, in the minds of many, were no longer simply a matter of succession. They had become a stage where something raw and unexpected had entered the script. That night, Kale did not return to a private alcove alone. He went back to his chambers, accompanied by a guard who had more years of trust than any other. Marcus remained at his side through corridors that smelled like damp stone and old fires. The king's wolves followed like shadows, padding soft, bodies warm against the chill that clung to marble. Inside the private room, in the dim where only a single lamp burned, Kale sat and considered the line of his hand as it rested near the bandage left on the servant's palm. He had not intended to declare anything when he moved toward her.
Choice had been a domestic thing in his memories. He had thought to honor memory in the quiet way of those who do not announce sentences passed in their hearts. Yet the choice had been public because the world around him demanded the publicness be maintained. He thought of his mate and of moons that had seemed then like a litany and not a memory. He thought of the ways sorrow had taught him to measure affection carefully, to keep it both private and precise. He did not know whether the movement he had felt in the hall was merely compassionate instinct or something deeper kindling against the long dark. He did not trust new feelings in himself. That was part of the old law he had learned. Distrust that which threatens to unsettle the map. Kale's mind, honed by centuries of negotiation, began to catalogue possibilities. A tale of a king who chose a servant would travel like a small conflagration through polite drawing rooms and kitchen hearths alike. It would alter attempts at alliance. It would force houses into decisions they had not intended to make. For better or worse, it had already set the realm on a different axis. Arya slept in the servants' wing that night, wrapped in a clean cloth and with a kettle of warm water sent by Bess. Grandmother Tess sat awake, the lines on her face a geography of care. She kept one hand resting on the folding of Arya's blanket, as if to make space for the girl's heart to steady. The servant who had been trained to be invisible was now a subject and an anecdote. When she closed her eyes, faces she had never meant to encounter crowded the spaces between dream and waking. Kale, alone in the lamplight for a long hour, allowed himself an indulgence that he rarely offered, memory without censure. He remembered hands that had combed hair away from a brow, small kindnesses that had no political bearing but held a life together. He remembered laughter like rain on dry streets. The remembering was not misery. It was a joint of warmth and ache. If grief had once been a net around him, it had frayed in places and revealed new air. He did not know whether what he had felt was the start of repair, or simply the echo of a long-practiced habit of protecting. The difference mattered, though he could not yet name which it was. The next days were a tight weave of ceremony undone and phone call notes. No modern words, the court had scribes and runners, but the meaning was the same. Houses sent private envoys, many to apologize for expectations disrupted, others to press the advantage of an unsettled court. Gror held meetings where he balanced the ledger of honor against the risk of resentment. Marcus kept watch and kept his counsel, eyes like someone who had seen storms and knew how to weather them without pressing panic into the wind. Arya was summoned to the chamber where the king took audiences. The summons was not ostentatious. It came as a simple message, "Come and be accounted for." She obeyed because her life had been taught to do so. When she appeared before Kale again, this time not amid broken cups, but inside the smaller private room that smelled of leather and wolf fur, she stood like someone who had rehearsed humility as a profession. Kale observed her with that old geometry of notice, taking in the set of her shoulders, the tremor at the base of her throat, the clarity of her blue eyes. "You do not owe spectacle," he said, an observation more than a rebuke. "This hall makes spectacles of ordinary things. You may keep your ordinariness." Arya looked up at him then and saw for the first time that there was a man there who had been taught to weigh everything in terms of duty, and who, in a small private way, was incapable of being merely a law. She felt that he could be both a ruler and a person grieving, that he could hold memory like a relic and still place his hand gently on a living wound. She replied with a voice that had been taught to shape itself to needful things. "I have always done what was given," she said. "I am not drawn to display." "Then truth can be less costly than a performance," Kale said, inclining his head slightly. In his tone there was no courtly flourish, only recognition. "You will have guards only if you wish them.
You will be allowed to speak when asked. That is the beginning, not the end. There was a small sharpness to his words, a permission offered without undignified gifts, without the ostentation of dowries or titles. It would, in the weeks to come, be read in many ways and cause many ripples. For now, it was simply an arrangement between two people in the lamplight. Outside the room, the wolves settled into the hush of kingship like an extension of his will. Shadow lay with head over paws and watched the servants' quarters with a lazy ferocity. Storm nudged the doorframe as if to remind Kale of something primal and obvious. Protection was not merely about rules, it was about proximity. Ghost padded toward the hearth and rested near the chair, a white knot of contentment that softened the edge of solitude. Word went out to those who needed to know. The ceremony had been ended. The houses sent couriers, and rumors turned to speculation. Some thought himself merciful, others thought him rash. Those with fewer scruples considered possibility. If the king could choose against expectation, could they place their own designs? It was a dangerous calculus. Greyor's mind paced the possibilities and found sleep less faithfully than usual. For all the clamor, however, the wolves were an honest gauge. They moved around Arya with a courtesy that was not practiced, but felt, instinctive and unpresentable. They accepted her as they would accept any creature who approached with steady heart and clear eye. That acceptance mattered in Valoran. Wolves were not mere companions, but the silent public that read the undercurrents kings could not always perceive. In the days following, the court adjusted to the new reality. The 1,000 invitations remained unrevoked, a lingering pressure like the heat of a hearth that had been banked. Many daughters never made it to the dais. Some houses chose to send presentations anyway, not because they believed they could change the king's mind, but because ritual mattered to them in the way water mattered to reeds. They presented as they had been trained to present, swords, poems, jewels, shifting displays. But the audience had shifted. The hall now listened for truth rather than merely spectacle. And truth, as Arya would discover, was a thing that could be read in the way a man blinked when he lied, or the way a ledger's ink showed tampering. Arya's presence in the hall, small and practical as she remained, began to carry the weight of a test. Her gift, if gift was the right name, was not spectacle. It was perception, honed by years of invisibility. She could sense when an account had been edited to disguise shortfalls. She could feel the tremor in a man's voice when he told half a truth. She learned to map motives like knots to be unpicked. And when she did so, the court listened because the king did. That listening made enemies and allies in equal measure. Several vignettes unfurled in the weeks that followed, small dramas that resembled the beating of a heart learning to function again. The quartermaster's ledgers, for example, grew suspicious to the careful eye. Wagons returned with grain missing. The storerooms were sometimes found lighter than accounted for. Arya, while tending to the domestic tasks that threaded her days, noticed a pattern in the way names were written. An odd smudge repeated at intervals, as if someone were copying entries from memory while concealing the origin of the stocks. She pointed it out to Grandmother Tess, who, in turn, told Bess. Bess, who could smell the faint aroma of burned stew from a cooked ration, took up the matter and found a trail of clever excuses. The small matter ballooned into a council issue when Grisar, through private channels, heard of the discrepancies and summoned Marcus to investigate. Marcus found the ledger entries were not the work of illiterate servants, but a pattern that implicated a retinue with access close to the royal stores. The matter was dangerous politically. Accusations had to be made with ironcloth confidence. There was need of proof, not rumor. Arya, quietly persistent, offered to help, not by public declaration, but by mending the ledger's trail with the subtlety she had learned. She watched faces during inventory counts and noticed the way one captain of the storeroom avoided the king's gaze and the way his hand left smudges of oil on the ledger's edge. She pointed these details out to Marcus in a private, practical tone. Marcus, who kept his judgments close to his chest, read the small signs and, with climbing caution, set a trap. The trap worked not through battle, but through honesty. Caught in the accounting, the storeroom captain confessed to a black market scheme that had benefited several small houses. The confession would have remained a whisper had the ledger not been corrected and the small theft turned into a public accountability. In the council, Grisar praised the finding as civic diligence, but those who watched knew it had been a servant's eye that had traced the pattern. The finding changed some minds. A few counselors softened their posture toward the presence of a servant near the king. Others, like Elena, tightened their social fists. Acts like these were not spectacles. They were small reforms executed with patience and attention, and over time they began to alter the rhythm of Valoran. When a small theft was exposed and rights restored, when a widow's petition reached the king because a servant had smuggled it into his notice, the court began to discover that influence could be wielded in ways other than performance. Here, truth and the capacity to see it proved more powerful than the most extravagant display. Yet for every fixer there was a critic. The houses that prized spectacle and lineage saw their claim to control erode in increments. Rumors multiplied about whether a king who could choose a servant could be safely trusted to manage the lineage of the realm. Letters were sent to allied houses inviting counsel and caution. Old wives in market lanes called these choices folly, while poets wrote new verses about a king who had dipped his hand into the common world and come up changed. The 1,000 invitations, long a symbol of the realm's order, reeled in the face of a new kind of power, the power of being seen. This was the slow burning of the long arc, one small, honest act leading to a trickle of changes that gathered into a stream. Kale and Arya's gestures were the rocks around which eddies formed. The wolves watched as courtiers changed their posture, and as the grave Gregor tried to translate mercy into policy without losing the girders of tradition. Marcus, who had stood beside Kale in the dark years and in the wars before those, kept his face as an anchor. He observed and protected with a loyalty that did not ask for reason, only for service. And for Kale, the most dangerous thing in that slow burn was not the affront from nobles nor the plotting of counselors. It was the tenderness that rose in him like heat. He had not believed himself capable of new attachments, and yet in the quiet moments, washing his hands after a council that had grown kinder, standing near the hearth while Arya refolded a map he had not known was creased, he felt a thaw. The emotion did not rush, it pooled and stained edges of his days. He kept it close, careful to name it as nothing more than a rekindled capacity to recognize a person as person. Still, recognition expanded into a habit of attention that was hard to call purely political. There were small nights when he found himself deliberately arranging to be present in the spaces where Arya moved. In the kitchen when Bess brought out stews fragrant with rosemary. In the forge where Ash, the younger wolf, rolled near the coals like a low-placed son. He learned, awkwardly and with a humility he had no formal training for, the pleasure of a shared joke with a woman who had never sought to command him. Their closeness grew not by grand gestures, but by 1,000 small exchanges, an extra slice of bread offered to a wolf, a silence kept through respect, a hand placed over the other's in passing. These were the kinds of intimacies that could either be mocked by the pomp of court or treasured as the beginning of different governance. Still, the court was not yet wholly altered.
Elena continued to sit in her appointed place with a strategic glare. There were house whisperings and faint threats about alliances unmade. Greor moved like a cautious chessman, trying to hold the realm steady between mercy and law. The wolves watched and received neither counsel nor sign, but their eyes recorded the shifting currents and reflected them in the way they slept and rose. One evening, while a thin rain smoothed the marble of the courtyards and the hall hummed like a shell with distant sounds, Kale sat alone with a small map and a pen. He sketched in the margins of his thoughts, an old habit that helped him render choice into policy. He considered what placing a servant near the throne would mean long-term, not merely in hearts and whispers, but in succession, in the handling of lineages, in the balancing of houses that would resent outside influence. He also felt the silly, mortal thread in himself that wanted something else entirely, to be seen and to be known without a ledger to mediate the intimacy. When he looked up, Arya was at the doorway, the lamplight haloing the plainness of her features. She had come to return a book he had left in the library earlier, a book of hunting poems, crusted with wolf hair and the smell of old paper. There was a moment in which the map between them closed like a hand. He stood, and they were simply two people who had been living for years under the same roof of calamity and custom. "May I come in?" she asked, not as supplicant, but as one requesting passage. He nodded, and the wolves gathered, courteous and amused, as if the sight of two humans exchanging ordinary courtesies was its own small entertainment. They spoke then in the dim for a time that held no records and no witnesses. They traded small confidences, childhood habits, ways of counting days when all the dates blur. He learned how she liked her bread toasted, and how she had once mended a child's sleeve in the street for no reason other than pity. She learned how he had once loved a woman who had sung off-key, and how he had learned to accept her laugh as a kind of music he could trust. Neither of them promised anything. They were not foolish enough for dramatic vow-making. Instead, they formed pacts measured in the cool language of the realistic. Honesty in council meetings, an agreement that neither would act from fear, the simple arrangement that if one needed solitude, the other would not insist on company. These were practical intimacies, the sort that survived the slow attrition of duties and decades. Outside, the city churned with speculation. Inside, small acts became the kindling of a different rule. The 1,000 invitations remained as a rumor and a pressure, but the choice made in the hall had shifted the kingdom's axis imperceptibly yet truly. Men and women recalculated where power lay, and wolves settled into their roles as both comfort and conscience. In the mornings, Kale rose with a sense of being not wholly alone in his remade world, and Arya stitched cloth with the awareness that there were watchers who feared and watchers who loved. The first fall of real resistance came not as a battle, but as a test. A merchant from the northern reaches brought news of a trade problem, wool shipments missing, tariffs misapplied, a region's discontent ablaze with small injuries. Grior convened council and presented the problem with the sober cadence of someone who had watched provinces go hungry to avoid civil unrest. Fingers pointed, as always, toward scapegoats. Yet this time the finger of suspicion could not gain purchase. A pattern smelled like deceit, but whose hands had shaped it? Kale listened as the council argued, noting Grior's flat reasoning and a few councillors' penchant for blaming distant governors without evidence. Arya sat quietly near the edge of the room, her fingers folded in her lap, watching faces as one watches flame. When the moment came, she leaned forward and spoke, not loudly, but with a steady clarity that the room could not ignore. "There is a seam in the trade sheets," she said. "It is not the governors who cut it, but a broker who balances inventory with a ledger that skips a place. He has been paid more than once by a house using special marks." Her words were few but precise. The pointing of the finger found a new direction, and Marcus moved with the kind of slow fury that rules with compassion can tolerate. The broker was caught, Evidence followed, and there was no spectacle of violence, only the revelation, the mild, almost apologetic unmasking of people who thought themselves clever. The council breathed, as if letting wind out of a tightened sail. Grior nodded, a tiny concession to a truth he had come to respect, that ordinary attention could accomplish what grand policy sometimes failed to do. The houses murmured. Some cheeks burned with disgrace, others with a sudden bright relief that the kingdom had not yet lost its administration. Events like this were ripples. They seemed small to those who preferred their politics to be loud and immutable, but to Kale, and to those who tended to him, they were proof of something larger. They seemed small to those who preferred their politics to be loud and immutable, but to Kale, and to those who tended to him, they were proof of something larger. That governance could be gentled by attention, and that a crown was not merely an instrument for enforcing fear, but also a means to be attentive, to listen, to notice, to correct. The test came sooner than many expected, and in a form that smelled at first like something ordinary. Elena Blackthorne pressed a motion at a full council, a formal inquiry into the king's recent household changes, couched in the language of succession and stability. She spoke with the precise venom of a woman who had long fed on etiquette as armor.
"Majesty," she said, "the realm must be assured that precedent is not being set by whim. For the good of Valoran, we require a display of competency from those who would sit near the throne." She did not say the word servant aloud. It hung between syllables like a compliment turned dagger. Grior, whose face had little room for surprise, proposed a measured approach, a public accounting of the household, and a series of attestations about the security of supplies and the reliability of those who tended to regalia. On paper, the plan was dry civil process. In practice, it was a set of riddles designed to put Arya in the uncomfortable light of scrutiny, to see if she flinched. Elena meant to see a flinch, and to make the flinch political. Rumor stitched itself quickly into banners. The 1,000 invitations that had hovered over the court returned to the conversation, invoked now as a threat of dissatisfaction if the council failed to act with proper dignity. In the taverns, people spat quick verdicts. In the market, children exchanged improvised rhymes that made mischief of the new arrangement. In the kitchens, Bess muttered two-fingered oaths and brewed a stew with extra rosemary to steady any storms. Kale felt the pressure like the shift of a moontide. It tugged at things he had tried to shelter. He followed the council into the hall of ledger and listened as accusations, half crafty, half ritual, were parceled into neutral words. Marcus stood at his shoulder as always, quiet as a shadow, a man whose loyalty bore the weight of years and the worn edges of battles that had long created evening stories. Marcus's presence was a reserve of steadiness. He was the hand that would close a door or open one. The first stone in Elena's strategy was a charge that the royal stores had been mismanaged under Arya's influence, that smaller houses had been shorted in their deliveries, and that certain ledgers had been mysteriously corrected. The accusation was not wild. It had roots in what had already been discovered. A quartermaster's theft that had been revealed earlier, the broker who had skimmed wool shipments, the seam in trade sheets that Arya had noticed. Those things had embarrassed some and improved others, but never had they been assembled into a puzzle meant to suggest incompetence. Arya listened from the outer benches with her hands folded, calm as a stone harbor. She felt the ricochet of the council's words as if they were pebbles thrown in a pool. She watched faces, the way a man pressed a thumb into parchment, the small habitual clearing of a throat, the tilt of an eye when a lie hid beneath a sentence. That attention was the thing people sometimes called a gift and sometimes suspected as a trick.
It was not supernatural. It was simply a practice of seeing. When the council vote moved toward a public hearing, one that would bring witnesses, list grievances, and establish a public ledger of errors, Elena spread the occasion like a net. She orchestrated a small chorus of retinues to testify about delays in shipments and subtle indignities. Members of the charred house of Lycan were encouraged to speak of missing wool. A widow from the southern marshes, coaxed and coached, tearfully rehearsed the shape of a lost provision that had not been explained in full. An officer of the guard offered a cautious complaint about a misfiled order. The assembly, in chittering fragments, made a web of plausibility. Grore's face betrayed the complexity of his position, custodian of tradition and broker of peace. He insisted on procedure, on evidence. That insistence was not only prudence, it was the shoring of a system that had outlived its builders. He called for witnesses, for the inspection of ledgers, and for a constable to verify the chain of custody. The meeting was a theater of civility, all courteous bows and soft-spoken examinations, and yet the undercurrent was no less merciless for its manners. Power did not have to shout to hurt. When testimony began, Arya noticed details no clerk had catalogued. A woman from House Isolde, present as a witness, used an expression common among their southern servants. An odd turning of the phrase that betrayed someone who had been coached by a local steward rather than by the house's higher literati. An inventory page, presented by a well-intentioned steward, bore a smudge in the corner in a pattern that matched a private housemark known only to certain households. A receipt used a slightly different ink than the royal scribe's stock. The flower on one witness's cuff did not match the mill referenced in the ledger. Each detail was small. Each detail suggested direction. She rose when the room allowed her a moment, not to beg or to plead, but to offer a request for simple time. "Let me speak to the storeroom captain," she said. "Let me see the receipts and the ledgers in private." Her voice was steady. It did not demand. The council, accustomed to more performative displays, blinked. Kale, who had grown used to letting others manage the protocols of his life, felt something like pride fold into his chest. He permitted her. In the storerooms, under a low lamp that threw the scent of oiled wood and stored grain into the air, Arya sat with the ledger and with the captain who had testified. She watched his fingers as he traced the lines, watched the way his thumb hovered when he lied without knowing. She noticed the captain's eyes when a particular house name was spoken, how a muscle near his jaw tightened, and how he avoided the ledger's inked initials. He spoke from habit, and therefore carelessly. He used the wrong round in describing a transaction. He mispronounced a village's name. To most, these would be simple idiosyncrasies. To Arya, they were the threads of a lie. She did not call the man a thief in the storeroom. She did not make a scene. Instead, she moved like someone picking a lock. She produced a scrap of receipt that had been overlooked, a discarded stub from a caravan master, a remnant of wax with an impression only made by a retinue's private seal. She placed the pieces together with the quiet enthusiasm of a seamstress reassembling a treasured garment. The captain, who had thought his tracks hidden in the ordinary sweep of his days, found himself with his own signature staring back at him as evidence. When they returned to the council, Arya presented the pattern. She spoke simply, pointing where the marks matched or did not. She explained why a certain smudge belonged to a broker from the north and not to the royal scribe. Her proof was not thunderous. It was the flattening of a small nitty-gritty fact until it cannot be ignored. Marcus corroborated with a measured statement about the chain of wagons. Grior pointed out the procedural consequences. The council, which had hoped to create an image of misrule, now found their argument thinner than they had desired. Elena, who had expected the public hearing to fortify her position, saw that an accusation that had been arranged like a play had unraveled in the wings.
She bristled and found new language to criticize. "This is not about malice. We only seek assurance." But assurance had been provided in stubborn detail, and the room, which had prepared for a spectacle of scolding, filed instead toward the less satisfying but more durable work of repair. The vote did not censure Varia. The council adjusted the inventory procedures and recommended the removal of the errant captain. That the reform bore Arya's stamp was a discomfort to some and a vindication to many. The victory was not complete. There were whispers that such reforms could be used as thin pretexts for further rearrangements. Elena's followers circulated thin accusations that Arya had undercut noble agency by revealing the failure of revenues. Yet the wolves told a simpler truth. During the council's debate, Ash had wandered into the chamber and laid his head at Arya's feet, looking up as if to say, with canine dignity, that his judgment was made. Animals do not understand protocol, and perhaps for that reason their verdict is often the most honest. The sight of a wolf choosing to rest by a woman's ankle had a way of settling the more performed anxieties of the room. The mid-climax that had been feared as a storm breathed itself into rain. The court, chastened and slightly rebalanced, moved on to smaller tasks. But the pattern remained clear. Truth, patient and domestic, could unmask cunning dressed in lace. After the council's reconciliation, and once the most immediate ripples faded, the kingdom took another quieter step. Kale offered Arya a more formal station at his private table. It was not a title of lands or a spectacle of ornaments. It was a stool and a place beside him when matters of household and daily governance were discussed.
"Sit," he told her, in a room that smelled of wax and wolf hair. "There are some things the hall does not need to know." He meant it as both instruction and invitation. They married in early bloom, a ceremony hardly noticed by the noisy part of Valoran and treasured by its quieter places. The garden where they chose to bind themselves was a small walled plot behind the hall, a place where wild roses escaped from their orders and moons always seemed a little closer. The wolves attended, as they always did, sitting in a loose semicircle like a chorus of guardians. Marcus said the words he had prepared with a soldier's brevity. Gregor offered a small clause on the record ensuring the legality of the union. Bess baked bread and broke it with the simplicity of someone who knew the worth of a shared loaf. Grandmother Tess smiled until her eyes dampened, not with tears of victory, but with the sort that come when a hand long used to folding cloth is finally allowed to rethread a life. There were no trumpets, no extravagant gifts. There was an exchange of glances and a tying of hands with a strip of cloth that had been mended through generations, a symbol, more than a jewel, of continuity. The marriage did not erase the friction that always rests upon public houses and their rivalries. It softened some arguments and inflamed others. Elena's fury did not evaporate like mist. She turned her designs inward, abandoning the louder routes and cultivating subtler maneuvers aimed at influence through alliances and marriages. But the garden seal and the wolves at their feet made the king's choice more difficult to treat as a mere whim. Years lengthened into a pattern of small, repeated intimacies. Arya learned the maps of law and ledger as adeptly as she had learned to fold linen. Kale learned the art of being present at a feast without making it a performance. They found rhythm in the small domesticities that tempered the weight of a crown. One who tended the wolves when the winter hunts were thin, one who kept a ledger of recipes so that the household ate seasonably. They shared mornings when the sun hit the east parapets and the wolves lay stretched across paving stones like living banners. They had children, as many had expected and some had feared. Children in Valoran are their own taxonomy of hope and politics. Small bodies that quicken alliances and test the patience of courts. The births were private, allowed to be ordinary in ways that had not been granted to royalty before. There were nights of worry and mornings of exhausted joy. Kale learned the precise, clumsy tenderness of a father who had once been most precise in treaties. Arya breastfed and bled as women had for centuries. And in that small and intimate literalness, the court gained a new image of a throne that could sustain human mess and still hold law. As they grew, the children became part of the kingdom's small revolutions.
They sat beside kings and learned how to count in threads rather than coin alone. They watched wolves play and learned that a ruler's rule could be as much about stewardship as it was about command. Educated by tutors and by the household's many hands, by Bess, by Grandmother Tess, by the patient guard, these children were less spectacle and more stewardship. Their existence refigured the succession slower than an edict could and deeper than a show. During decades of joint rule, policies changed in increments. Arya's insistence on attentiveness found a measure in law. More transparent audits for public stores, hearings for smaller grievances, legal recognition for the voices of those who had been expected to be quiet. The changes were not dramatic in the way songs often demand. They were more like the careful work of menders, seams reinforced, a torn hem restitched. The wolves were given a modest degree of sanctuary rights, spaces where they could roam without fear of being driven from ancestral grounds, an administrative change built from conversations and petitions more than from proclamations. Trades that had been carved by a few hands began to admit evidence and accountability. When a village's wells ran thin, the court no longer waited for a dramatic storm of voices. Servants and small nobles could send petitions that would be read not as impertinence but as data. Kale's grief, which had once been a map with few roads, softened into a landscape of memory that could be visited without drowning. He told different types of stories at hearths now, not solely of the woman who had been lost 2 centuries earlier, but of mornings in which a small hand had curled around his finger, and of a woman who had taught him the taste of tea with honey and the virtue of saying "I do not know" when one truly did not. The household's intimacy, built on small acts of trust, offered him a new vocabulary with which to name affection. Their rule also created new resistance. Some houses, stripped by slow reforms, withdrew their daughters from the social dances of alliance. There were marriages that shifted alliances in ways Grior could not have fully guessed. And there were shifts in trade where old merchant families found new competitors. Elena remained a figure of cultivated resentment, her salons a place where criticism of the king became a kind of art form. She voiced complaints about the dilution of tradition and worked, in her cool way, to gather those who shared her views. There were letters and cold visits and the occasional pointed absence from court feasts. But the more concerted attempts to remove Arya from influence foundered against the kingdom's new habits. People who had once accepted secrecy learned the value of witness. As decades passed, the rhythms of domestic life became the most reliable proof of their rule.
They taught statecraft at the table, how to hear a petition, how to temper punishment with attempt at repair, how to grant mercy without abandoning justice. Children were raised to test a claim with both a ledger and a listening ear. Ministers were promoted for craft as much as for line. The wolves' lithe presence continued to punctuate events. At harvest festivals, they would romp and be pelted by children's laughter. During solemn sessions, they would lie solemnly by the dais, as if to say that some things required quiet vigilance. When the first silver threaded Kale's hair in ways that time could not disguise, it was not panic that tempered him, but a bittersweet humor. He remained a Lycan, and the slow beating of centuries still resonated in his bones. But the edges of his long life had been softened by years of ordinary love. He and Arya argued over small things, whether the younger wolves should be allowed near the children during hunting practice,
whether a certain ambassador's gift required more suspicion than thanks. But those quarrels folded quickly into laughter. Time, however, is patient and relentless. Arya's hands, once quick and unscarred, began to show the map of years. Her hair threaded with the faintest gray at the temples. Her step sometimes missed a beat after a long day in the archives. She moved slower in the mornings and slept with a steadier breath at night. Kale watched the years in the hollows that formed at her eyes when she was weary, and in the way her voice grew softer at the edges but steadier in the depths. They cared for each other with an intimacy that was both fierce and practical. On a bitter winter when a fever took Arya in the night, Kale did not obey the rituals by sending away the household. He stayed by her bed and watched the slow carriage of her pulse. He braided her hair, not as a king, but as a lover and a man who had learned, ridiculously late in his life, how to braid. He sat through dull dawns with their cups of near-cold tea and read aloud trivial lines from an old book of hunting poems they both loved, finding in the cadence a small comfort they could hold between them. The wolves, who had come to know her scent as the nightly, ordinary thing, became her attendants of a different sort. Ghost lay with his head on the mattress chair and breathed in a rhythm that matched Arya's slow inhale. Shadow kept watch at the window, and Ember patted his nose against Kale's hand when the king grew too still with worry. In the soft domesticity of that long house of stone, even an immortal's capacity for grief learned new forms of expression. They did not cheat death, they civilized it. Arya, like all humans, moved toward the end that was proper to her kind. When the time drew near, it did so with a mercy that many of the household could not have asked for, but were grateful to receive. She slept more, spoke less, and tasted the world as if each vole mattered. The children, no longer children, but adults who carried their mother's steadiness in their hands, took turns at the foot of her bed. Bess kept a pot warm, and Grandmother Tess, who had been the cartographer of their early days, hummed work songs as if to stitch the air with memory. On a cool evening when the moon bore witness, Arya asked Kale to carry her into the garden they had chosen for their vows. The roses had weathered many winters and were handsome with old branches. She wanted to go where the world felt larger than its small cruelties. He wrapped a cloak about her shoulders and took her hand with a gentleness that had become habitual, an action practiced enough to be second nature. The wolves padded at their heels, respectful and still, as if they too understood the reverence of the moment. Arya lay down on the bench beneath the rose-patterned arch and looked at the sky. The moon hung low as if listening. Kale sat beside her, the long weight of his life made brief by the intimacy of one human heartbeat beside another. She spoke, not in long philosophy, but in particulars, a way of naming ordinary things for good measure. "Remember the time Ember swallowed the piece of linen?" she said with a thin smile. He laughed, a sound that uncoiled years of tightness. "You blamed me for that," he replied, and she shook her head in mock scolding. There was no scene of miraculous defiance of natural law. There was only the slow, kind conclusion of a life well tended. Arya took Kale's hand and tightened it, as if to commit the pressure to memory. Her last words were simple: "Thank you for seeing me." He had said similar words to her in the Marble Isle decades earlier, but now the weight of the phrase pivoted the rest of his life. He had chosen to see, and that choice had stretched like a net into the realm. When she slipped away, it was as gentle as a breath cooled by night air. The wolves arranged themselves around her as if to form a living ring of warmth. A hush went through the household that was not the silence of abrupt tragedy, but rather the gentle folding of something loved. Kale held her until the final breath left, and then allowed the rest of the household to offer what rituals they could. The mending of cloth, the careful marking of names on ledgers, the baking of bread to feed those who would stand in vigil. Greer offered words of record and law. Marcus stood as mute as ever, his face a rock of feeling without edges. Kale's grief this time was different. It was not a hollow that echoed through his bones and turned his nights into long pre-dawn marches. It was a warmth with a raw edge. He felt a multiplicity of losses, the loss of touch, of shared tea, of the quiet voice that had taught him to notice, and alongside them the consolation of memory. Where his previous morning had been a long crystallized winter that sharpened everything into careful stillness, this grief was wet with experience. He had loved and been loved in a way that offered proof of what it meant to live fully. The kingdom responded with the muted grandeur that true mourning requires. The wolves mourned in their way too. Shadow lay longer at the palace steps. Storm paced once each night along the outer ward. Ash moved through rooms with a peculiar slow deliberation. Ember refused to eat for a day. People who had once considered the king's private life a theater found in his grief a human anchor. They softened in conversations and offered small counsels. Some houses, those that had once moved to contest the marriage, brought wreaths and low words of condolence, as well as subtle gifts of closing ranks. They were not entirely changed, but they were altered in gradations. Kale did not retire the way some rulers retreat into stone. He continued to govern, because there were children to raise, and treaties to preserve, and wolves to feed. Yet he governed with a memory that had heat. His decisions favored the household's habits of listening. He taxed less for petty levies and asked more often that petitions be read aloud. He walked among people more because he now understood that sight itself had been an act of mercy. He would often be seen, in mornings when the mist still clung to the river, feeding the younger wolves by hand, or sitting on a low stool while a child practiced a verse of diplomacy. Decades passed. The children, grown into their own roles, took on responsibilities, some inheriting lands, others directing the household's administration. The council, once tightly bound to the old calculations of lineage as power, had evolved into a body more willing to admit evidence, to query accounts, to listen to those who had once been sidelined. Greer grew older and then retired with the small satisfaction that comes when one has kept balance in one's ledger. Marcus, persistent as ever, aged into a figure of near legend. People told stories of his steadiness the way others told of older, more violent heroes. Even Elena, whose face had once been a shape of perpetual discontent, softened in public displays. She still carried grievances, but found small pleasures in the new forms of influence she could exercise as an elder stateswoman. Kale lived on. Immortality is a strange inheritance. It damps the urgency of some things and intensifies the meaning of others. He continued his reign for many more years, a ruler whose old sadness had been threaded with the memory of the woman he had chosen. He never stopped missing her. He stopped, however, being haunted by the absence. Her life became, in his remembrances, a lantern rather than a void. He found himself speaking to visiting envoys of the king's of ordinary kindnesses, of broken cups that turned into an invitation to repair. And sometimes those tales were met with snorts, and sometimes with tears. He kept a small room in the palace where ordinary things were kept. A mended handkerchief, the bandage Grandmother Tess had tied on that day, a book of hunting poems crusted with wolf hair. He visited the garden each season and stood where their vows had been exchanged. The roses still climbed the archways as if to show off old stitches of memory. People spoke of the 1,000 women who had, for a moment, been gathered under one roof as political players. Poets made legends of the way ambition and humility had met in that one hall. The phrase 1,000 women battled became, in time, shorthand for the pressure and theater that accompany succession. But for many, the real moral of the story remained the small one. That one small, quiet action had rewritten a script. A cup breaking on marble had revealed not merely a clumsy servant, but a possibility. That seeing someone, the simple act of attention, could rearrange power's geometry. The wolves aged too. Shadow's muzzle silvered and his steps shortened. Storm took to sleeping more in the sun. Ember grew placid and tolerant. Ghost, with an old dignity, moved more slowly along the ramparts. They died in order, one by one, and each death sent a ripple through the household as familiar as any tide. Kale mourned each in ways peculiar to the life he had led, often by standing at their graves and leaving a single bone or a scrap of cloth. The wolves' memory lived on in the places they had run and in the images carved on shields and tapestries that would communicate across generations the idea that rulers should be watched by something that asks nothing in payment. In the latter years of his reign, Kale became a kind of living bridge between the past and the present, between policy that had once been a cold ledger and decisions that now included the quiet evidence of ordinary life. He had the physical markers of long years, lines at the corners of his eyes, a gait slower than the one he had once used to pace council chambers. Yet his voice remained a thing people listened for. When he spoke, it carried not only the weight of crown and time, but the texture of living tenderness. When he thought back to that day, to the single crash of metal on stone that had made him move, he often pictured the hall's stunned silence and the way Shadow had lifted his head to sniff at Arya's feet. The memory was a small, plain scene with the potency of a lamp lit in a dark room. He never pretended the choice had been a strategic masterpiece. It had been a human one, an uncalculated act of attention that changed the ledger of his life and, by extension, the ledger of Valoran. The 1,000 ambitions that had been present that day had not all been placated. Some had been redirected. Some had been disappointed. But the kingdom had been set upon a different course, one that honored the practice of seeing and the daily work of justice.
In the new songs that were made about him in later years, the lines focused not on throne or conquest, but on the way a king could be led by small mercies. Bards with quieter strings sang of a monarch who had kept wolves and who had chosen a woman who had been trained to be unseen. Their verses praised not simply the choice, but the small acts that followed. The ledgers corrected, the trades protected, the wolf sanctuaries preserved. At the end of his own long arc, Kale sat more often in the garden where the vows had been spoken. He kept the strips of cloth as he had always kept things, carefully, as if every object were a small map of affection. Children and grandchildren came to him with questions about governance and with small private requests for advice on how to be tender in positions of authority. He taught them, in the same soft manner he had learned from Arya, that seeing was a responsibility. He taught them that sometimes the most courageous act was a small and ordinary kindness. And when he died, centuries after his mate had first left the world, and decades after Arya's passing, people spoke of him as a king who had carried sorrow, and who had allowed it to transform him rather than to harden him. The story of the 1,000 invitations remained in classrooms and taverns as an emblem of the old ways of power. The story of the broken cup and the servant who had been chosen stayed with households and hearths as an emblem of how change begins, with attention, with hands that stoop to pick up a shard, with a word that says, "She will be seen." If you have loved listening to how small truths can remake entire worlds, subscribe for more tales where the simplest acts, an offered hand, a careful eye, an unassuming courage, change the course of lives. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that being seen is sometimes the greatest gift we can give one another.